Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Moche culture of Peru. Now, the Moche are a culture, were a culture and a civilization which existed on the northwestern coast of Peru, somewhere near the modern-day city of Trujillo. Their capital was called Moche, and hence the name of the culture. Now, they were a pre-Columbian civilization, which means that they existed before contact or discovery of the New World by the Europeans. What is interesting about the Moche is that they left a lot of artifacts, in fact, but we don't really know much about them, and a lot of the things that we assume to know about them is purely speculation based on the artifacts that they left. The artifacts that they left are, various ceramics, various metal statuettes, tombs, stuff like that. And all of these artifacts are of quite high quality, but nonetheless, we don't know anything about the Moche for any concrete sake because they never left the written language, or at least we assume, but more on that later. The more important discoveries of the Moche was of a tomb of a lord, or we assume him to be a lord, called the Lord of Sipan, Sipan in this case being a Peruvian city. His tomb was discovered in 1987, and it has a quite interesting history of how it was discovered, because it wasn't discovered, through various proper means such as archaeologists or historians. Instead, it was discovered by looters, because in Peru at the time there was a big problem where thieves would try to find ancient tombs and then take the artifacts, sell them off on the black market, or in worst case scenario, if it was a precious metal, just melt it down and sell it as is. Now, the thieves found this tomb of this lord, and they saw some gold artifacts. They did not like to share between each other, and they got into a fight. The fight alerted the police, and the artifacts were eventually confiscated and put in a museum. Now, we do not know whether this guy was actually a lord of anything. He might as well have been a high-ranking priest or a high-ranking warrior. What we know for certain are 3 pieces of information. That is, the lord was 5'4" at the time of his death, so quite short, and he was about 35 to 45 years of age, which I would assume in his time was quite old. The third piece of information is that we know for a fact that he was important. Again, we don't know his specific rank, but he was definitely important. The proof of this importance is the aforementioned dress, the golden regalia. Also proof of his importance is that the lord was buried with 6 people, 3 of whom were women, and we assume them to be wives or concubines, and 3 were men, who we assume to be guards or warriors, regardless of who they were. Interesting fact is that the guards/warriors were buried with their feet amputated. Now, I do not know if the amputation was the cause of death, or if it occurred before the burial and that the wounds healed, but regardless. However, a little aside, to me it doesn't really make sense. I would assume that the whole point of the guards is that they would guard the tomb, right, in the afterlife. But if you are amputating their feet, I would assume that in the afterlife, they would also be the same, but regardless. Now, there is an additional tomb recently discovered in 2013 of the priestess queen of San Jose de Moro. She was important for the very same reasons as the Lord was important, because she was, dressed very ornately, and she also had some people buried along with her in her tomb. In this case, it was 2 women who we assume to be servants and 5 children. We presume all of them to have been sacrificed before the burial, and we also assume that or at least I assume, that the children were not the priestess queens and were of her attendants or of somebody else, because in general it doesn't really make sense to sacrifice your own progeny. Now, why do I bring up these 2 tombs? Well, 1, they are of high importance to the Moche culture, and this is a video on the Moche. Secondly, I have been referring to the Moche as the Moche, indicating that they were one centralized state. But historians and archaeologists believe this not to be the case, because there have been mummies found throughout Peru on former Moche territory, which we assume to be of equal rank, and this means that most likely the Moche were a decentralized confederated state which shared a general culture of the elites, the same religion, and also a similar language. Now I will talk more about the language. So in the north of the Moche territory, they spoke Mochico language, which went extinct around 1920, and in the south of Moche, they spoke Kingam language, which went extinct around the 16th century. Now, in the beginning of the video, I mentioned that the Moche did not have a written language, but we do not know this. There have been theories that the Moche did in fact have a written language, and it is a quite interesting theory. Now, you see, in 1939, Senor Rafael Larco proposed that the Moche had a writing system based off of lima beans. What I mean by this is that the lima beans had engravings of lines and dots, and that these represented some sort of pictographical symbol, an early prototype of written language. Of course, we do not know whether this was the case, because the beans could have been used as simple decoration, because after all, they are decorated beans, or as pieces of some game which has now lost to time. I have been able to find an academic paper which dives more deeply into this topic, and largely the results are inconclusive. However, I did find this really interesting picture of an anthropomorphic lima bean, which you can now see on the screen. In my layman's opinion, I personally believe that the Moche did have a written language. Whether it was expressed through lima beans is beyond me, but my theory is very simple, is that the Moche were very advanced in their technology, as we have seen previously with the Lord of Sapan, and we will see later with their canals and arts and etc. And to me, it seems very incongruent that a culture so technologically advanced would not be able to advance something as simple as writing. But now we will move on to the canals. So the Moche lived in a dry, arid environment of Peru. It's mountainous, dry, cold, not an ideal place for agriculture. And so to help them, they developed a long system of canals, which you can now see on the screen, which collected water runoff from the mountains and then was used to irrigate crops. A very impressive feat of engineering. Going on to art. So the Moche were artists and were quite good at their craft. Their two primary artistic mediums were ceramics and metallurgy. And I will start on the less interesting one, which is metallurgy. Now, we know that Moche discovered both electrochemical plating and depletion gilding, because we have found copper artifacts with a thin layer of gold on top. As we saw previously with the Lord of Sapan and the Priestess Queen, they particularly enjoyed the large flared headdresses made of gold, and also this interest of headwear extended into, as was life, extended into death, as the Moche made intricate copper masks for their deceased. The Moche also had made statuettes, which were primarily made of copper, and these statuettes represented either gods, anthropomorphic gods, mind you, but more on that later, and humans. In their metallurgical description, the humans seem to be more of a symbolic nature rather than realistic. As you will see in the ceramics, this is slightly opposite. I could go on about metallurgy, but I will cut to the chase because I assume from the title of this video, this is what you would like to know about, and that is the Moche ceramics, and specifically the Moche sex pots. Now, a little bit about the ceramics before diving into the sex pots. The Moche were very, very, very good at ceramics. We know this, one, by the quantity of the ceramic that they left, which means most likely they discovered clay molding technology. But do not think that just because the Moche made a lot of ceramics, that the ceramics were of low quality. As you can see on the screen, these ceramics are quite good and are fit to be in any museum of the world. While the Moche represented various things, heads, for example, very realistic looking heads, as you can see on the screen, their primary ceramic obsession was sex pots. Pots which depicted the hot and heavy of life. And while being of high artistic quality, they also give an interesting look into the sex life of the Moche. While I would like to show you the sex pots in all of their naked glory, I suspect that YouTube would perhaps not appreciate that, but don't worry, these can be found very easily online. As I mentioned previously, the pots give an interesting look into the sex life of the Moche. For example, we know that anal sex is most often depicted while vaginal is much rarer. The Moche were very particular about this because in the pots they made sure to include both orifices, with one being more actively used. Furthermore, there are instances of where the couple's act is being committed while the female side is breastfeeding. Also, fellatio is sometimes shown in the pots, but the reciprocating act is not, and this indicates to us that the Moche men did not particularly strive to please their women. A more bizarre theme, at least in my personal opinion, is a depiction of the skeletons in various acts aforementioned, and also sometimes, doing solo acts. Being frank, I have tried my best to find some sort of segue away from this topic, but I can't, and so I will just awkwardly move on into the gods. We do not, again, as with all things Moche, we do not know any specific religion they had. We can only assume from the artifacts that they left. Any specifics, completely unknown. What we do know in general is that they had three primary gods. The first one being Ai-Paek, or Ai-Apayek, who is a creator sky god, and is often represented with a jaguar headdress, which is adorned with bird feathers and snake earrings. It is widely believed that these animals carry symbolic meaning, with the bird meaning the sky, which represents the gods, the jaguar representing earth, which is thus humanity, and the snake representing the underground and thus having a connection to the deceased. Fortunately, little side note, I have not been able to find any sex pots depicting Ai-Paek, as he is quite scary. Second, we have Si. She is the female moon goddess and is believed by some to be the most important goddess to the Moche because she controlled both seasons and storms. Unfortunately, I have not been able to find any concrete depiction of her, but I have found this statuette in a museum catalog, and in the museum catalog it is called a moon deity, and I assume is to be a representation of Si. The third and the final god has perhaps one of the coolest names I have ever heard of, and that is the Decapitator. Right, the Decapitator. I think you might guess why he is called that. He is often depicted, as you would expect, with a severed head in one hand and a ceremonial knife in the other. Now, the Decapitator was most likely the Lord of Darkness or the God of Darkness, and despite his, evil nature, he has a chance of being a very important god to the Moche. And why is that? Well, because like with other pre-Columbian civilizations, the Moche practiced human sacrifice. The Moche also like to drink the blood of the sacrificial victim, whether before or during the ceremony, we do not know, but we do know that they did like to consume blood. Most likely, the sacrificial victims were tortured for weeks before the actual sacrifice. Why was drinking blood important? Again, we do not know the specifics. There could be some religious undertone. It is also suspected that the drinking of blood was intended to humiliate the sacrifice. Because you see, the Moche existed in Peru, and Peru is in general a very dry land. And because it's a dry land, any bit of fluid that a person might have is very important. And thus, having this fluid be taken by your enemy is very humiliating. Proof of this being humiliating, I have only been able to find in a passage of the Wikipedia entry. This is a direct quote from some source. Unfortunately, it's uncited. I would prefer to give you the direct citation, but since that's unavailable, I'll just quote verbatim. Quote, Moche artwork frequently depicted the passage of fluids, particularly life fluids, through vulnerable human orifices. There are countless images of defeated warriors losing fluids through their nose or helpless victims getting their eyes torn out by birds or captors. Unquote. Now, we also do not know who the victims were in these sacrifices. It is posited by some that they were losers in some religious games, or most likely they were warriors from neighboring tribes who were captured. Regardless of who it was, the sacrificial rituals and the beforehand ceremony intended to inflict maximum humiliation and pain. And because the Moche most likely reveled in these sacrifices, it is likely that the Decapitator god was in fact quite high ranking among them. Human sacrifices aside, the Moche are a very fascinating culture. However, they went extinct about 700 AD. Most good things unfortunately do not last. As with all things Moche, we have zero idea on how they collapsed. We only know things that most likely did not happen. For example, we know that they most likely weren't conquered, as there's no archaeological evidence of any invaders. Secondly, they existed before the conquest of the Spanish, and thus pestilence was unlikely to be a major factor in their downfall. The most commonly held theory is that it was largely environmental. The Moche most likely experienced a super El Nino event, which would have caused a prolonged period of flooding, followed by an equally prolonged period of drought. Evidence in support of the environmental theory is that in latter parts of the Moche existence, various Moche villages started to create defensive structures. Now, since the Moche were most likely not conquered, it indicates that these defensive structures were used to quell internal unrest. Internal unrest that would arise from not having enough food, resources, water, etc., etc., etc. Regardless, the Moche disappeared around 700 AD, and with them their fascinating culture. It is very unfortunate that we don't know much about the Moche, and I really hope that there will be further discoveries, but, this is perhaps wishful thinking. Thank you very much. Please like and subscribe.